Investigators in the criminal justice system often call on experts for help. There are forensics experts specializing in DNA evidence. There are criminal profilers who delve deep into the labyrinth of the human mind, untangling the most twisted of psyches. And then there are the most controversial consultants of the bunch, those whose expertise comes not from science or academic study, but from a world beyond our own. They are known as the psychic detectives, and these are their stories. 27-year-old New Orleans resident Andre Deigel disappeared on June 9, 1987, after a night of drinking and playing pool with a friend. The local police didn't suspect foul play, but some of Andre's loved ones had a suspicion that the authorities were wrong. Desperate for answers, his sister Elise McGinley contacted Rosemarie Kerr, a supposed psychic. They met on the night of June 13th, and Elise brought a photograph of Andre and his two brothers. When Rosemarie placed a finger onto the photograph, she claimed to see a vision of Andre sitting in his truck next to a man with long blonde hair. She also saw water, a long bridge, and railroad tracks, accompanied by a splitting pain in her head. She believed that something terrible had happened to Andre. Next, Rosemarie placed a finger on a map of Louisiana, moving it around until she felt a tingling. Then she stopped. She advised Elise to get to that spot as quickly as she could. This suggestion from Rosemarie led to the discovery of Andre's body in a swamp and the eventual capture of his killers, who had murdered Andre as a test of nerves and stolen his truck. She even took the witness stand during the trial, explaining her experience and claiming that she helped solve the case. Elise McGinley corroborated her story. Some psychic detectives attribute their findings to clairvoyant visions or just a, quote, feeling that leads them in the right direction, while others insist that they have communicated directly with the victim's spirit. This was the case with Jacqueline Poole, found murdered in her West London apartment in 1983. After the police put out a call for any information that might lead to a break in the case, they received a call from a woman named Christine Holohan. She'd never met the victim or her family, but she'd been sensing a spiritual presence that she believed to be Jacqueline, or Jackie, as she was sometimes called. The spirit, she claimed, identified herself as Jackie Hunt, the victim's maiden name, and a different name than had been published in the press. In her call to the police, Holohan described the details of the murder and the case that had not been released to the public, including an address book that had been found at the scene and the presence of 2 coffee cups found in the kitchen by police. Holohan also claimed to have done automatic writing in order to channel the spirit and identify the name of the killer. One name written down was Pokey. As it turned out, Pokey was the nickname of Anthony Ruark, a friend of Poole's boyfriend and one of the police's prime suspects. However, there was no solid evidence to link Ruark to the crime, and the case went cold for 18 years. But then an informant approached the authorities, causing the case to be reopened and leading them to re-examine old DNA evidence. A sweater in evidence, one that had been taken from Ruark's trash, contained skin cells, fluids, and clothing fibers that linked him to the murder. In August 2001, Anthony Ruark was convicted of the murder and sent to prison. On November 23, 1982, an 18-year-old Amy Hoffman disappeared after leaving her part-time job at a New Jersey shopping mall. Her car was found in the parking lot the next day, with the driver's side door open and her purse on the front seat. As the police began to investigate, forming a task force, they reached out to Nancy Weber, a psychic that they'd worked with on previous cases. She was able to describe details of the case that she should not have known anything about. Without any guidance from the officers, she was able to lead them to the crime scene where Amy's body had been found. She warned the officers that the killer would strike again. Sure enough, a second body was discovered, belonging to Deidre O'Brien. A witness reported seeing a green sedan leave the rest area where the second body was found, identical to the car that Nancy had described seeing in a vision. She became certain that it was the same culprit. Nancy and the task force followed the trail to a man named James Kodatich, who was later convicted of killing the girls. This was not the only murder case that Nancy Weber assisted with. In 1987, when a 42-year-old nurse and mother, Elizabeth Cornish, was found murdered in her apartment, police could only pinpoint one suspect: Cornish's boyfriend. However, Cornish's family couldn't believe that he would have hurt Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's sister reached out to Nancy Weber for her to take on the case. Weber got in touch with the local police, and at the crime scene she told them that the killer was actually Cornish's upstairs neighbor, a man she described in detail without ever meeting. The man in the upstairs apartment, 33-year-old John Reese, was brought in for questioning, but he had an alibi. That is, until the coroner re-examined the body and determined the time of death had occurred earlier than the initial autopsy suggested. This left Reese without an alibi, and he confessed to the crime shortly after. In upstate New York on May 15, 1986, 72-year-old Dora and Jake Cohn were shot and killed in their home. There were three main suspects: the couple's grandson, James Mariani, and two men believed to be his accomplices, Keith Snare and Robert Skinner. However, all of the men had alibis that seemed to check out. At a dead end, the police brought in a psychic, Noreen Rainier, to assist in the case, at the request of the Cohn family. Rainier determined that the couple had known their killer and that three people had been involved in the crime. This piqued the interest of investigators, who decided to conduct an experiment. They prepared a lineup of photos for Noreen to touch, including men who had no connection to the murders, as well as Mariani, Snare, and Skinner. With her eyes closed, Noreen selected the same three men who the police had initially suspected. After the three men had their alibis placed under more scrutiny, the authorities found that they simply fell apart. Mariani, Shane, and Skinner were later convicted of murder and sent to prison for the crime. The community of Staten Island, New York was rocked by the tragic disappearance of 14-year-old Susan Jacobson on May 15, 1976. She went out for ice cream that afternoon and never came home. At first, the police refused to consider the possibility of foul play. It was more likely, they insisted, that Susan had decided to run away from home. But Susan's father believed otherwise. He contacted a psychic by the name of Dorothy Allison, requesting her help with the search for Susan. When she met with the Jacobsons, Dorothy described a vision of Susan's death. She had been strangled by her boyfriend. She detailed several images that she believed to be linked to the body's location: two bridges, the twin steeples of a church, the smell of oil, and the letters M.A.R. 2 years later, Susan's body was found in a pair of oil drums at an abandoned World War I shipyard. There, the steeples, the bridges, and a rock with the letters M.A.R. spray painted on it could all be seen. Evidence at the crime scene led to the arrest of Susan's boyfriend, Dempsey Hawkins, who was deported to his home in the UK and sentenced to 22 years in prison for the crime. Ashley Howley disappeared from the Columbus, Ohio area in June 2004, sometime after a Michigan medium by the name of Christy Robinette was sleeping when she was awoken by what she later claimed to be Ashley's spirit. The female spirit that shook her awake said that she had been murdered and needed Robinette's help. She described Ashley's presence as a translucent figure with a gray tint. She later told ML Live about the experience. "I could tell she was a spirit and she had not crossed over. So she began to search for missing girls in their 20s with a resemblance to the spirit she had seen. Her search led her to Ashley Howley. Robinette called the police. She told them what she had seen and was in contact with Howley's family. She told them that Ashley had been murdered by her boyfriend and wanted justice for her death. Over the years, Robinette described visions of light-colored pines given to her by Ashley. Robinette followed these clues and, along with a relative of Ashley's, was able to pinpoint a likely spot where her body could have been buried. In 2008, Ashley's body was found in the same area that Robinette had identified, and Ashley's boyfriend, Robert McMichael II, was arrested. It was August 2002, at a family barbecue in Soham, England, where every parent's worst nightmare came true. Two girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, suddenly disappeared without a trace. A friend of the Wells family reached out to a psychic, Dennis McKenzie, for help. He hoped to have good news to report them, but as he told Express UK in 2009, "As I got closer to Soham, I had a heavy feeling of foreboding. As I got out of the car, I heard my guide saying in a very clipped, precise voice, 'They're dead.' I felt sick inside. When I found myself in Kevin and Nicola's presence, I asked them how direct they wanted me to be. They begged me to be straight with them. I had no option but to break the news. Back then, I had never ever had to say anything so terrible to anyone. Words cannot describe my feelings." He told the family that the girls had been dead by 7:30 p.m. on the day of their disappearance. He offered more insight than just the time of death, however. He described the culprits he believed to be responsible. There was a woman with brown hair and a man in his 30s, both with northern accents. He also told the family about an old red car which had been used to transport the girls, and the view from the house where they had died. It included a ditch and a building like a windmill with no sails. The bodies were, he said, dumped into shallow water. Kevin Wells passed along Dennis's predictions to the police, and the girls' bodies were found in shallow water. The kidnappers and the killers were identified as caretaker Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr. Huntley drove a red Ford Fiesta and lived in a house with a view of a ditch and a grain silo. Dennis and Kevin remained friends after the case was closed, and Kevin thanked him by name in a book he wrote about the tragedy. Not all psychic criminal investigations go smoothly. Sometimes the psychic attempting to solve the crime winds up as a suspect instead. On December 21, 1980, Etta Smith heard a news report concerning the disappearance of a woman named Melanie Uribe and had a sudden vision of the body's location. Naturally, she took that information to the police and told them that she could help them find Melanie's body. They gave her a map, and she pointed to Lopez Canyon, about 25 miles from Los Angeles. The police were immediately suspicious of this strange woman, who refused to say how she knew the body's location other than just stating that she just knew. An LAPD detective told Etta to go home and come back the next day. Then the department would prepare a helicopter and conduct a search. Etta refused to let it go and came back an hour later with an update. She had gone to Lopez Canyon with her children and niece in tow, and they had found Melanie's body. Etta was arrested on suspicion of playing a part in the murder, but she refused to admit any involvement. After 4 days in jail, her story had not changed. While Etta was in custody, the police received a tip. Someone had overheard 3 men bragging about robbing and killing Melanie Uribe. There was no connection between Etta and the 3 men, who later confessed, and Etta was released. She sued the city of Los Angeles for wrongful arrest and was awarded $26,184 in damages. This bad experience with law enforcement didn't deter her from investigating future cases, however, and she continued to work with the LAPD on unsolved mysteries. It's understandable that most police officers would be skeptical of police psychics, but some formerly skeptical detectives have had experiences that changed their minds. For example, one particular case turned Alton, Illinois detective William Fitzgerald into a believer. In 1983, Fitzgerald publicly credited Greta Alexander, a psychic from Delavan, Illinois, with providing 22 clues that led to the discovery of a murder victim's body. Mary Cusette, who was believed to have been killed in April of that year, was found in an area south of Peoria. According to Fitzgerald, Greta had predicted not only the body's location, but its condition: missing a foot or a leg and detached from its head, and the fact that it would be found by a man with a bad hand and involve the initial S. The body was in fact discovered by an auxiliary policeman named Steve, who had injured his hand years prior. The body was separated from its head and missing its left foot. After Mary's body was found, her boyfriend, Stanley Holiday Jr., was arrested for the murder. In October 2003, the decomposed body of a formerly missing woman, Maria Scott, was found wrapped in a quilt and dumped in the bushlands on the ground of Triple Care Farm in Australia. Prior to her disappearance, Maria had been a resident there. As the investigations ran out of leads, Detective Senior Constable Jeffrey Little decided to look for help in unconventional places. After watching an episode of the television show Sensing Murder, which followed psychic detectives attempting to solve unsolved cases, he contacted clairvoyant Debbie Malone and asked her to weigh in. He later told the Daily Telegraph, "Her description of what happened was so close to what we found, I included it in the coroner's brief. I don't know whether he took any notice of it, but she was brilliant. She told us how the body was positioned in the bush, where it was found, and what Maria was wearing." As Malone continued to assist on the case, she was given a bangle that had been found on Maria's body and asked to see what she could divine from the object. She was able to lead the police to the place where the murder had occurred and pointed out bloodstains on the walls. Strangely enough, she reported feeling the spirit of Maria's killer passing through her. This was odd because she only ever experienced the sensation with ghosts. What Malone didn't know was that the prime suspect in the murder, Mark Brown, took his own life. This seems to confirm Little's suspicions about the case. He told the Daily Telegraph, "I was extremely skeptical at first, but then I couldn't explain how she knew these things when all we gave her was a bangle." In November 1971, 16-year-old Patricia List's teacher reported her missing after the girl failed to turn up at school. Police went to the List family home in New Jersey to investigate and found that the entire family was dead, except for John List, Patricia's father, who had left behind a confession and skipped town. 14 years later, in 1985, Detective Jeffrey Paul Hummel learned about Elizabeth Lerner, a psychic living in Ocean County, New Jersey. Her reputation was impressive, so he reached out. He met with Lerner and presented her with a variety of crime scene photos. She told Hummel that List was alive and had not left New Jersey by plane. He had a new woman in his life and was now connected to either Florida or Virginia. She also made an inaccurate prediction that List would visit the family gravesite on September 17th. Though that didn't happen, List was eventually found in Virginia, where he had begun a new life with his second wife and was arrested. Psychic detectives have been around for quite some time. Most of the cases we've covered so far are from the recent past, within the last 50 years or so. But this next case is over a century old. On November 20th, 1901, 19-year-old Ella Maud Nell Cropsey disappeared from her home in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. She stepped out onto the porch at around 11 p.m. to speak to her boyfriend, Jim Wilcox, and was never seen alive again. Suspicion quickly fell on Jim Wilcox, but without a body, there was little anyone could do. Enter Madam Snell Newman, a psychic from Norfolk, Virginia, who arrived on scene and told the police about a vision she had of Jim knocking Nell out with chloroform, wrapping her in a blanket, and throwing her body down a well. Her body was not found in a well, but rather in a river, said by some to be connected to a nearby well. Jim Wilcox was arrested and brought to justice, but many in the Elizabeth City area believe Nell's spirit is still not at rest. To this day, there are rumors of her spirit roaming the grounds of her former home. A woman named Penny Sarah disappeared from Connecticut in 1971, and the lack of hard evidence stumped the police. So they brought in Mary Pasquarella Downey, a psychic who had a vision of Sarah's supposed murderer. In the vision, she saw a mechanic who smelled strongly of oil and wore a name tag with the letter E. In addition to this information, she gave the police some bad news. The murderer would not be found anytime soon. She was right about that, and the case went unsolved for another 30 years until evidence surfaced that linked Edward Grant, a mechanic, to her crime. What makes someone become a psychic detective? What leads them down that path and compels them to try and help solve the unsolved? According to Fiona Johansson, also known as the Persian medium, she stumbled into it by accident. She told Forbes that the case that she solved was close to home when she was living in Stockholm. When her neighbor went missing, she began to get the feeling that something horrible had happened. So she went to the police and helped them locate the missing woman's body and arrest the perpetrator. She's continued her work ever since and claims to have solved disappearances and cold cases while working alongside local, state, and federal law enforcement. In 2017, Vice spoke with Troy Griffin, a psychic investigator, who said that he began investigating unsolved cases after a chance encounter in a friend's gift shop. He met a woman there who asked him if he was psychic, then told him about a case that she was working on with the local police. She gave him a name and a location and asked him to tell her what he saw. He replied that the person was not missing, but had been hit with a pipe. Several weeks later, he learned that he was, in his own words, 98 to 99% accurate on the case. When asked what his process looks like, Tony gave an example concerning a 28-year-old cold case in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. The new chief has been there a couple of years. He got a lead about a potential victim being buried in concrete in a foundation wall. He got a warrant and thought that he saw a tooth in the concrete. They tore out the foundation wall to see if they were on the right track. I asked him to tell me about the wood chipper. He said that they believed she was cut up, put in a wood chipper, and mixed in with concrete and sawdust. So what I did after that, and it doesn't always come instantly, but over the next couple weeks I remember saying, tell me about the jewelry. The suspect is an ex-detective in the town who was fired for embezzlement and pawning stolen jewelry. I found a suspect who lives in the same town and went to the same high school. He owns a construction company and went to jail for pawning stolen jewelry. My job was to give the new suspect's name. Not all supposed psychics who contact the police end up providing helpful information. In some cases, they wind up sending the department on a wild goose chase. Take, for example, one particularly embarrassing instance in Texas in 2011. A woman claiming to be psychic reached out to police in Houston, Texas, informing them that there had been a mass murder at a rural farmhouse there. She described a grisly scene, including dozens of dismembered bodies, some belonging to children. But when the police investigated, they found nothing. At first, the report seemed as if it could be credible. Then there was a smell of rotting flesh on the property and blood on the ground. Not only that, but the woman described the property's layout in detail and seemed to know it well. But the blood was from a drunken brawl that had occurred weeks before, and the smell was meat rotting in a broken freezer. The woman had likely just been to the property before for one reason or another, and the investigation was considered a waste of time and resources and made the police department the subject of widespread mockery. One particularly notorious psychic detective who got it wrong was Sylvia Brown. A year and a half after 16-year-old Amanda Berry's disappearance, her mother appeared on the Montel Williams show, where she was given the opportunity to speak to Sylvia Brown about her daughter's fate. The psychic's words were devastating. "She's not alive, honey. Your daughter's not the kind who wouldn't call." Berry's mother was devastated and told the Cleveland Plain Dealer that she believed in Brown 98%. She wanted to have hope, but after 19 months, it began to seem like there was no hope left. For years, it seemed like Brown was right. No new lead surfaced. It looked like Amanda might never be found. But then, in 2013, Amanda Berry was found alive. She had escaped from a house where she was held captive for a decade, traumatized but very much alive. Sylvia Browne could not have possibly gotten it more wrong. The incident led to a flood of criticism directed at Browne, who, as it turned out, had done this before. In 2002, she made another appearance on The Montel Williams Show alongside the parents of Sean Horbeck, a missing 11-year-old boy. She told them that Sean was dead, his body would be found near 2 jagged boulders, and his killer had dark hair and dreadlocks. Every single aspect of this prediction was proven false when Sean was found alive in January 2007 in the apartment of Michael J. Delvin, who, as it turned out, did not have dreadlocks. Skeptical Inquirer conducted an extensive study on Browne and her predictions, published in April 2010. They examined 115 cases that Browne was involved in and determined that she was demonstrably wrong in 25, and in the remaining 90, there was either not enough information to make a decision or the crime remained unsolved. They chronicled several other notable failures on Browne's part, such as claiming the miners were alive during the Sago mining disaster when they were actually dead, and predicting that a 9/11 firefighter was still alive when his body would be found buried under the World Trade Center rubble 2 weeks later. In 1999, when she performed a reading for the family of a missing 6-year-old, Opal Jo Jennings, she told the grandmother, "She's not dead, but what bothers me now, as I've never heard of this before, but for some reason, she was taken and put into some kind of slavery thing and taken into Japan. The place is Kukuro or Kukura. In fact, Opal was not in Japan. She had been murdered by Richard Lee Franks and died from head trauma within mere hours of being abducted." She was similarly wildly off base in the case of Holly Cruson, another missing person. On live television, Browne told Holly's mother, "She's in Los Angeles, and when she was calling you, she was on drugs, but she is still alive." In 2006, remains that had been sitting in a medical examiner's office since 1996 were identified as Holly's. While Browne was claiming that Holly was on drugs and working in a Los Angeles nightclub, the girl had already been dead for 6 years. For many, the problem goes well beyond Sylvia Browne. Some are skeptical of psychic detectives as a whole and consider any supposed success to be nothing more than a fluke. Joe Nickell, a former stage magician and private investigator, has written a great deal about various psychic phenomena with the purpose of debunking them. In his view, whenever a psychic has supposedly solved a crime, it's not that their predictions were correct, but rather that people are able to retrofit the clues onto the facts of the case after it's been closed. In hindsight, the clues appear to be accurate, but they didn't actually predict anything. One example he uses is a case we already covered in this video: the murder of Mary Cassette. Several of her clues, as he points out, were not actually accurate, including the proximity of the church to the body. He's also pointed out false leads that led nowhere, such as one provided by Dorothy Allison, another familiar name, who told the police in Nutley, New Jersey that a missing boy was buried in a drainage ditch. After they spent hours digging, the authorities concluded the boy was not there. In his Investigative Files article, The Case of the Psychic Detectives, he details several other famous psychics, including the real-life inspiration for the television show Medium, Alison Dubois. He points out in his piece that despite claims that Dubois had worked with the Glendale, Arizona Police Department and the Texas Rangers, both departments deny ever having worked with her. Glendale Police spokesperson Michael Pena said that the detective who investigates missing person cases does not recall using Dubois at all. The Texas Ranger spokesperson, Tom Vinger, said, "The Texas Rangers have not worked with Alison Dubois or any other psychics." Nickell also covers psychic profiler Carla Barron of Los Angeles, who is claimed to be involved in solving 50 cases over 2 decades. However, when the independent investigators group looked into 14 of the cases named by Barron, they found that all of them had either been solved without her involvement or were still unsolved. One particularly infamous claim is Barron's insistence that she worked on the O.J. Simpson case and even worked directly with the Brown family. Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, has disputed this, stating that she's never heard of Barron, nor have any of her family members. Nichols' views on psychic detectives and the views of many other skeptics can be summed up in this oft-cited quote of his: "They count their lucky guesses and ignore all their misses." Former FBI analyst and profiler Clint Van Zandt echoed this skepticism and shared his thoughts on psychic detectives in a piece for NBC in 2005. He wrote, "Some psychics claim to see remote images, some read into the future by looking at the palms of our hands, chiromancy, or tea leaves, tasseography. Some rely on information from spirit guides, and may even practice cleidomacy, divination through interpreting the movements of a key suspended by thread from the nail of the third finger of a virgin's hand while psalms are recited. Others hold an object related to the crime in their hands and get the impressions of the victim, the crime, or the criminal. Psychometry. One psychic network claims success in just over 20% of their cases, something that appears far less successful than that of a mere guess in a 50-50 situation. It's possible that some psychics are just really good interviewers or body language readers. Some of them will roll out names and numbers waiting for some response from the person, and then they'll enhance that point of information to fit the situation. My point is this: if psychics were truly successful, and if their results were not simply the consequence of trickery at worst or good interviewing skills at best, then why don't law enforcement agencies have psychic detective squads, real X-Files units, or other ways to integrate these paranormal investigative capabilities? He continued, "Each of us can believe what we choose, but in the criminal justice field, crimes are solved by investigation and information, not by rubbing sticks together, huddling over a Ouija board, or talking to a spirit guide." A 17th century dowsing sleuth was tested in Paris and failed every test given to him. A 1991 test of a London-based police psychic concerning her ability to use psychometry to solve crimes suggested that she had no such skill. And a standing $1 million reward for anyone who can prove paranormal power still remains unclaimed. What happens many times is that professed psychics allow themselves the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. After the case is solved, they make their previously vague predictions that somehow fit the crime and the criminal. I've had psychics tell me the victim was killed near a body of water. The murder took place along Lake Michigan. Come on, that victim was buried in a shallow grave. Most killers don't necessarily take the time to dig a deep grave. Or that the victim was buried in a remote location. That's right, we haven't found her yet, so she could be somewhere remote. He admits that he would be willing to listen to a psychic tip if he thought that it might lead to answers, but with the caveat that until psychics establish the track record of multiple successes like those of criminal analysts, I wouldn't bet the farm on their ability to name the next pope or to tell us who really shot JR or JFK. Many other police officers seem to share this view. They might be skeptical or downright hostile to the idea of psychic investigators, but at the end of the day, they'll take whatever gets results. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and a cold case with no solution in sight can make a potential believer out of many a skeptic. Even if they would never work directly with a psychic, law enforcement often feels bound to investigate any credible tips and follow any leads that might uncover answers. Whether it's an educated guess, amateur sleuthing, or bona fide psychic ability, as long as the case gets closed and justice is served, does it really even matter? Now check out The Pig Farmer, Canada's most evil serial killer, or watch this video instead.